Ron Howard has always been the calm center of chaos, a director who believes in dignity, restraint, and kindness. But when he was asked about the darker side of the business that raised him, his expression changed. "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped," he once said quietly. To him, the golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was a world built on silence, cruelty, and exploitation. A world where fame excused everything. The same actors who shaped America's dreams also destroyed countless lives behind closed doors. And now, decades later, Ron Howard is willing to say their names. Errol Flynn, the devil behind the smile. Before there was James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero who embodied charm, danger, and reckless desire. On screen, he was the perfect adventurer. Off screen, he was something closer to a predator. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn arrived in Hollywood during the 1930s and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood, 1935. The studios built an empire around his charisma, but beneath the polish lay a man consumed by arrogance and addiction. By 1942, his reputation turned poisonous. Two teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused Flynn of statutory rape. The trial, splashed across every newspaper, divided America. Flynn laughed through testimony, mocking the charges as if his own stardom made him untouchable. Warner Brothers hired elite lawyers, fans camped outside the courthouse, and studio executives secretly paid witnesses to vanish. He was acquitted, yet his behavior only worsened. In private letters later revealed in 1978, Flynn bragged about his conquests and mocked the women who feared him. Ron Howard once described reading about that trial as a turning point, when I realized Hollywood could protect monsters if they smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn remained a rogue. To insiders, he was a cautionary tale. Alcohol, cocaine, and financial ruin consumed him. By 1959, at just 50, his body collapsed in Vancouver after years of abuse. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers. But for Howard, the true cause was simpler. He died the same way he lived, taking everything and giving nothing. Flynn's story became the blueprint for Hollywood's moral decay, a reminder that charm can hide cruelty and that fame, in the end, forgives no one. Kirk Douglas, the man who couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas represented the perfect contradiction of Hollywood's golden era, a man who spoke of honor and justice on screen while spreading fear and humiliation off it. Born Isur Danielovich in 1916 to poor immigrant parents, Douglas climbed his way out of poverty through raw willpower. By the time Spartacus made him a global icon, he had everything: fame, money, and respect. But those who worked with him remembered something darker, a violent temper that never turned off when the cameras stopped rolling. Crew members described Douglas as impossible to please, prone to sudden explosions of anger that left people in tears. Actress Deborah Paget once said, "He didn't just want to dominate a scene. He wanted to dominate everyone in it." Howard, who studied Douglas's performances as a young filmmaker, later admitted, "There's a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that eats a person alive." That rage would follow Douglas for the rest of his career. Whispers of his behavior toward women have haunted Hollywood for decades. Biographers and insiders alike have pointed to his involvement in the 1950s rape of rising actress Natalie Wood when she was just 16. A claim that surfaced after Wood's death and was repeated by her sister Lana in her 2018 memoir. Douglas never faced charges, and the story was buried under the same machinery of silence that protected so many powerful men of his era. Even after his death in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy resurfaced, not as gossip, but as a reckoning. On film sets, his presence could inspire and terrify in equal measure. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, called him the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. Ron Howard once reflected that the lesson from Douglas's career wasn't about talent or fame, but about power. He believed the rules didn't apply to him, and Hollywood agreed. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many saw an old man seeking peace. But for Howard, it was something else, the final act of a performer who had spent his life outrunning his own demons. Beneath the applause lay a truth Hollywood never wanted to face, that some of its greatest legends built their legacy not on brilliance, but on fear. Faye Dunaway, the Queen of Cruelty. If Errol Flynn embodied corruption and Kirk Douglas symbolized unchecked rage, then Faye Dunaway represented something colder, cruelty wrapped in beauty. To Ron Howard, she was proof that evil in Hollywood didn't always come with violence. Sometimes it came through control, humiliation, and ego so vast it crushed everyone around it. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway's rise was meteoric. From Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, to Chinatown, 1974, she seemed untouchable, a goddess of cinema, icy and magnetic. But behind that brilliance, stories of her cruelty were whispered across the industry. Crew members spoke of her tantrums, her endless demands, and the way she treated assistants as disposable. Her Mommy Dearest co-star Rutanya Alda once said, "You could feel the fear on set." Everyone was waiting for her to explode. That film, meant to be a dark portrait of abuse, became a mirror of Dunaway herself. Ironically, while playing Joan Crawford, a woman infamous for cruelty, Dunaway reportedly mimicked the same behavior. Director Frank Perry later confessed that he considered quitting because of her violent outbursts. She threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and once refused to film until the lighting made her look divine. Ron Howard, years later, cited her as an example of what happens when an actor's need for control turns into emotional terrorism. The stories didn't stop there. During The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman and spat on a crew member. On Don Juan DeMarco, she was said to have humiliated assistants until production halted for a day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, her reputation caught up with her. Hollywood stopped calling. Directors refused to work with her, claiming she was unmanageable. In 2011, after being fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone but herself. When a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, his response was diplomatic but cutting. She chased perfection so hard she forgot compassion. Dunaway's downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling. The woman who once conquered Hollywood ended up isolated, avoided even at retrospectives of her own films. For Howard, she symbolized the price of cruelty, a warning that talent without empathy eventually destroys itself. "People talk about power," he once said, "but in Hollywood, power without grace turns to poison." John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few figures towered over Hollywood like John Wayne. To millions, he was the embodiment of America itself, the fearless cowboy, the soldier, the man's man. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching him on black and white television, the reality behind that rugged image was far darker. "When I learned what he was really like," Howard once reflected, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa, Wayne rose through the studio system by projecting a myth of unshakable masculinity. By the 1950s, he was more than an actor. He was an ideology. He saw dissent as weakness and progress as betrayal. On film sets, he ruled with intimidation. Technicians who failed to meet his expectations were cursed out in front of everyone. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. You either agreed with him or you were gone." Howard later called that kind of atmosphere the opposite of art, its fear pretending to be discipline. Wayne's cruelty extended beyond the workplace. He was known for belittling women publicly, mocking indigenous actors on Western sets, and dismissing black performers who challenged stereotypes. His 1971 Playboy interview remains one of the most disturbing documents of Hollywood's golden age, a conversation in which he declared that Native Americans were selfishly keeping land, that black people were not yet responsible enough for self-governance, and that films needed men, not whiners. The statements ignited outrage decades later when they resurfaced, revealing not a patriot, but a man trapped in hate. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed bitterly with director John Ford over his insistence on portraying Ethan Edwards, a racist, vengeful Confederate, as sympathetic. Ford pushed back. Wayne refused. In the final cut, the character's cruelty bled through, but so did the actor's contempt. Ron Howard, who later studied that performance at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even in his final years, weakened by cancer, Wayne never apologized. He dismissed critics as soft and blamed the changing culture for his isolation. He died in 1979 at 72, still hailed by many as an American icon. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story became a cautionary tale. Proof that power built on prejudice doesn't age into wisdom, it curdles into bitterness. "The myth survived," Howard once said, "but the man behind it never deserved the legend." Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski represented the one truth Hollywood never wanted to face, that brilliance can coexist with evil. "I admired his films before I knew who he really was," Howard once admitted. "Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them." Polanski's rise was meteoric. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents and a survivor of Nazi occupation, he seemed destined for tragedy long before fame. His breakout films, Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, made him a genius in the eyes of critics, a visionary who turned paranoia into poetry. But the darkness that haunted his movies wasn't fiction. It was a reflection of himself. In March 1977, the illusion shattered. Polanski was arrested for the sexual assault of 13-year-old Samantha Gailey after a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. The evidence was overwhelming. Polanski pled guilty to unlawful sex with a minor. Before sentencing, he fled the United States, escaping to France, and never returned. Hollywood split in two. Some condemned him, others defended him as a tortured artist. For Howard, then a young filmmaker, the reaction was devastating. "They spoke of art while a child's life was broken," he said years later. Polanski's exile became one of Hollywood's greatest moral stains. He continued directing abroad, winning an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Howard described as surreal and sickening. As the audience at the Dolby Theater rose in applause, Howard refused to stand. "I thought of that girl, alone at 13, and how applause must sound to her ears." Even decades later, the industry's willingness to separate genius from guilt infuriated him. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out. To Howard, that moment symbolized justice arriving late, but not too late. "It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day, that a monster doesn't become less monstrous because he can frame a shot," he told Vanity Fair in 2021. Polanski remains free in Europe, untouchable but haunted, his name synonymous with hypocrisy. For Howard, his story embodies everything that poisoned the Golden Age, a system that protects the artist and abandons the victim. "Hollywood forgives anything," he once said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Roman Polanski symbolized Hollywood's hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney embodied its illusion, the idea that charm could erase cruelty. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, the discovery of who he truly was came as a shock. "He was the face of joy," Howard said once, "but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it." Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Mickey Rooney was Hollywood's first true child superstar. By the time he was 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire on his grin, the all-American boy, singing and dancing his way into hearts. But fame at that scale warped him early. He married 8 times, cheated endlessly, gambled away millions, and humiliated those who loved him. His ex-wife Ava Gardner called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, the darkness deepened. In 2011, his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his stepson were accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation, draining Rooney's accounts while isolating him from family. But decades before that, the damage Rooney inflicted on others was already legend. Former co-stars described him as volatile and cruel. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately, "He could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next." Garland, pressured by studio heads and emotionally broken, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, shared blame for her suffering. By the 1960s, his career had imploded. Addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, Rooney claimed, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived them all for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's bitterness never faded. He blamed everyone, studios, wives, even God, for his downfall. When he died in 2014 at the age of 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000. His body, initially unclaimed, was eventually buried in Los Angeles after friends raised money for a modest funeral. For Howard, Rooney's story was the final piece in a pattern, proof that the Golden Age's smiles were masks. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said, "and maybe that's the saddest evil of all, when pain turns into performance and no one notices." For Ron Howard, these stories were never about revenge. They were warnings. Hollywood's golden age wasn't made of gold at all. It was built on silence, exploitation, and broken lives hidden behind fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror films. They're the ones the spotlight protects. Which of these 6 actors shocked you the most? The predator, the tyrant, or the smiling liar? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from the dark heart of Hollywood.